If someone earning the average salary wanted to match Elon Musk's net worth, they'd need to work not just a lifetime, but around 8 million years. To put that in perspective, that's about 30 times longer than humans have even existed. And by the time you've heard that sentence, Elon has already made another $100,000. But here's the wild part. He's not the richest person in history. In fact, he doesn't even crack the top 5. Let's rewind time and take a look at the people whose fortunes make even Elon Musk seem modest. And we'll start with a name you probably know, not from Wall Street, but from crime documentaries: Pablo Escobar. Back in the 1980s, Escobar built an empire that made him one of the wealthiest criminals in modern history. At his peak, he was pulling in around $420 million per week. That's right, every week. Adjusted for inflation, his total net worth reached an estimated $80 billion. Still less than Elon today, on paper. But here's the difference. Escobar's wealth wasn't tied up in tech companies or political power. It was cash. Physical money. So much, in fact, that he reportedly spent $1,000 a week just on rubber bands to bundle his piles of bills. And storing that cash, a logistical nightmare. Rats, mold, and the elements destroyed an estimated $2 billion worth of his fortune each year. Imagine being so rich, you lose billions and barely notice. But believe it or not, Pablo was just the beginning. There are figures in history whose wealth dwarfs even his. Stick around, because we're about to meet the richest person to ever walk the earth. So, Pablo Escobar wasn't the richest person ever, at least not overall, but if we're talking actual liquid cash, he might top the charts. Now, let's travel further back to witness a very different kind of wealth. It's the year 1945. World War II has just ended. In the United States, millions of soldiers are returning home to a thriving economy. Back then, a single income could support an entire family. The American dream, alive and well. But across the globe, hidden in the shadows of the war's devastation, emerges one of the most powerful and wealthiest men in history. Enter Joseph Stalin. As the iron-fisted dictator of the Soviet Union, Stalin wasn't obsessed with personal riches. He owned very little, just a collection of pipes, some books, and a simple military uniform. Sure, he ate better than the average Soviet citizen, and he lived in relative comfort. But he wasn't swimming in luxury. His official salary was modest, equivalent to about $30,000 a month in today's money. Still, his son once claimed that Stalin barely touched his wages. In fact, he often let the checks pile up on his desk. He didn't even have a bank account. So why is Stalin considered one of the wealthiest men in history? Because he didn't need money. He controlled everything. Stalin owned the entire Soviet state in the most literal sense. Nothing moved without his say. Even whispering the wrong joke could land you in a gulag. Or worse, his authority went so deep that when he suffered a stroke in 1953, no one dared call a doctor for 12 hours. Why? Because they were terrified he'd recover and punish them for acting without his permission. That's how absolute his power was, and the economy he ruled over, in today's terms, it would be worth over $10 trillion, more than every billionaire in the world combined. So technically, Stalin was broke, but with the power to seize, silence, and control at will, he had a form of wealth that made money irrelevant. And that brings us to an important realization. To uncover the richest person in history, we can't just look at money. We have to examine wealth in all its forms, from raw cash to political control, to the value of equity in world-changing companies. Each person you're about to meet represents a different version of extreme wealth, from cartel cash kings to emperors and industrial giants. So who comes next? Let's turn the page to 1909. That's when a young artist, Adolf Hitler, was still selling paintings on the streets of Vienna. Back in 1909, a young man wandered the streets of Vienna, broke and completely unknown. His dream? To become a great artist. But life didn't go as planned. After being rejected twice by the Academy of Fine Arts, Adolf Hitler found himself penniless, selling cheap postcards and small paintings just to survive. He spent his nights in shelters, drifting between hostels with barely enough to eat. Then came World War I, which changed the direction of his life. After serving in the German army, Hitler began diving into politics, and by 1923, he attempted a coup to overthrow the government. a failed move that earned him 9 months in prison. You might hope that kind of time would lead to reflection or reform. Instead, during those months behind bars, he wrote Mein Kampf, a manifesto filled with racist ideology. When it was first released in 1925, the book didn't exactly fly off the shelves. But as Germany's economy worsened and nationalism took root, its popularity surged. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, Mein Kampf was everywhere. Then, things took a new turn. Hitler began monetizing power. He ordered the government to purchase 6 million copies of his book to distribute to soldiers, government officials, and even newlyweds. Meanwhile, he pulled a political loophole, exempting himself from taxes and dodging what would have been a $2 million bill, but he didn't stop there. He copyrighted his own image, allowing him to collect royalties from every postage stamp that featured his face, and he monetized his speeches by earning fees whenever they were printed in newspapers. With this web of passive income, Hitler quietly raked in millions. By the end of his life, Mein Kampf had sold around 10 million copies. For context, Anne Frank's diary outsold it 3-1, but Hitler's largest personal revenue stream, if you can call it that, came from donations. Between 1933 and 1945, he received an estimated $5 billion in contributions, largely from wealthy business tycoons and industrialists hoping to stay in favor with the Nazi regime. Still, all of that was just money. His real power came from conquest. By 1942, Nazi Germany had control over much of Europe. The regime looted entire nations, stealing resources, artwork, gold, and even putting millions to work in forced labor camps. In modern terms, Hitler controlled an empire valued at over $3 trillion. It's chilling to realize how deeply one man could exploit a nation and a continent for wealth, resources, and power. But now, let's shift gears, away from dictators and into the industrial age. Because before men seized wealth through military might, there was one man who built an empire with an entirely different philosophy. Next segment, Henry Ford. In the early 1900s, Henry Ford revolutionized not just the auto industry, but modern life itself. In a bold move in 1914, Ford decided to double his workers' wages, raising pay from $50 to $2.50 to $5 a day. He also gave them Saturdays off, reducing the work week from 6 days to 5. Ford had a radical realization: if workers are paid fairly and get some rest, they'll work harder and become customers too. He'd also been inspired by the speed and efficiency of meatpacking plants, so he adapted a similar approach to car manufacturing: the moving assembly line. Before Ford introduced it, building a Model T took around 12 hours. Afterward, just 90 minutes. This brought the price of a car down from $850 to just $290, suddenly making cars affordable for the average American. And for over 50 years, the Model T held the title of best-selling car in history. But Ford's greatest invention wasn't the car itself. It was how we live today. Thanks to cheap cars, people could move out of crowded city centers. Suburbs were born, commutes became normal. The modern middle-class lifestyle? That was Ford's legacy. After the world saw the success of his manufacturing methods, they quickly spread, transforming economies, industries, and entire societies. That's why many credit Henry Ford with inventing not just a car, but the middle class itself. So while Henry Ford may have only been worth around $200 billion when adjusted for inflation, his impact on the modern world is almost unmatched. Cars, suburbs, commutes, the 40-hour workweek, even the idea of a middle class, all trace back to his innovations. But Ford didn't build his empire in a vacuum. His success was only possible because of the men who laid the groundwork before him. Let's go back to the late 1800s, the peak of unfiltered, turbocharged industrial capitalism. We're talking about a time when the light bulb, telephone and telegraph were just emerging. Factories ran around the clock, pollution was a sign of progress, and child labor entirely legal. There were no regulations, no safety protocols, and 14-hour shifts were just normal business hours. This was the era of the robber barons, and 3 men defined it. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the original Titan. Vanderbilt made his fortune dominating railroads and shipping, creating the infrastructure that literally moved America. At the time of his death, He was worth more than the U.S. Treasury itself. Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who rose from a poor textile worker to become the king of steel. Carnegie revolutionized construction, helped build America's cities, and then did something rare for tycoons of his time. He gave most of it away. Before there were tax breaks for philanthropy, Carnegie donated the modern equivalent of billions, funding libraries, universities, and cultural institutions across the world. He wasn't just building with steel, he was building legacies. John D. Rockefeller, but the richest of them all? John D. Rockefeller. In 1870, he founded Standard Oil, and within a decade, he controlled 90% of America's oil refining. His rise wasn't just about innovation, it was also about ruthless strategy. He outmaneuvered competitors, bought out rivals, and slashed prices until he ran the industry. By 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court had seen enough. They ruled Standard Oil an illegal monopoly and forced it to break into 34 separate companies. That sounds like a massive blow, right? Not exactly. Rockefeller owned shares in every single one of those new companies. And when they went public, his wealth exploded. It turned him into the world's first billionaire. By 1913, Rockefeller's fortune equaled about 2% of America's GDP. To compare, that would be like someone today having a net worth between 400 and 600 billion even. Elon doesn't touch that, but before the industrial titans took over, there was a family whose financial empire shaped entire continents. Next segment, the Rothschilds banking beyond borders. The year is 1744. The United States doesn't exist yet. There's no electricity, and the average life expectancy is about 30 years. In a small Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt, Germany, a boy is born, Mayer Amschel Rothschild. He began with rare coin trading, slowly building trust and making connections among Europe's elite. But Rothschild wasn't just playing for personal wealth, he was thinking generations ahead. In the early 1800s, he launched what would become the world's first international financial dynasty. He sent each of his 5 sons to major financial centers across Europe: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. Without telephones, airplanes, or modern banking systems, the Rothschild brothers managed to stay connected, relying on couriers, coded letters, and a tightly run family network. The result? A web of banking houses so vast and reliable that entire nations came to the Rothschilds to fund wars, rebuild economies, and launch mega projects. They helped finance the British war effort against Napoleon. They funded the construction of the Suez Canal. They even provided loans that kept entire monarchies from collapsing. The Rothschilds didn't just hold wealth, they controlled the flow of money across Europe. The Rothschilds may have built the first global banking empire, but their long-term survival wasn't just due to strategy. It was born out of necessity. For centuries in Europe, Jewish communities faced systemic discrimination. They were banned from owning land, excluded from many industries, and constantly at risk of having their property seized or being exiled entirely. So the Rothschilds had to think differently. Instead of investing in land or physical assets, which authorities could easily confiscate, they focused on financial instruments. That meant stocks, government bonds, and international loans, investments that could move, multiply, and exist across borders. And to ensure their wealth stayed within the family, they famously practiced the cousin strategy, that is, arranging marriages between cousins within the family to preserve power and fortune, much like royal dynasties of old. This combination of financial acumen and guarded family structure helped the Rothschilds avoid persecution longer than most. But with this deep-seated secrecy came speculation. Over the years, rumors about the extent of their wealth exploded into fiction. Some conspiracy theories have claimed the Rothschilds are worth $500 trillion. Let's be clear, that number is wildly exaggerated, more than 5 times the global GDP. There's absolutely no credible evidence to support it. In fact, today, the only Rothschild you might find on the Forbes billionaires list is Jeff Rothschild, a tech executive who worked at Facebook. And no, he's not related to that Rothschild family. While the family's wealth today is highly dispersed, with different branches across Europe, their centralized financial power is largely gone. But during their peak in the 19th century, the Rothschilds managed a fortune so vast that as a collective, It may well have been the largest family fortune in history. On an individual level, the richest Rothschild was Nathan Mayer Rothschild, who operated out of London. Known for financing wars and underwriting empires, his estimated net worth, adjusted for inflation, sits somewhere around $20 billion. But even that number doesn't tell the full story. His power came not just from wealth, but from influence. He had the ear of kings, the trust of nations, and the ability to move markets with just a whisper. But if you think that's impressive, let's travel further back in time, long before billionaires, before banks as we know them, to a name nearly forgotten by history, but whose fortune may have topped them all. Next segment, Jacob Fugger, the banker who bought empires, head back to 16th century Europe. The world is dramatically changing. Christopher Columbus has just returned from the so-called New World. The Catholic Church rules everything, and religion shapes nearly every aspect of life. Amid this backdrop, in Germany, a man named Jacob Fugger is born into a wealthy merchant family. Unlike many aristocrats of his time, Fugger didn't inherit wealth and sit on it. He scaled it. Starting with merchant trading, he quickly expanded into mining and banking. And soon Jacob Fugger wasn't just doing business. He was financing entire kingdoms. He gave out massive loans to fund wars, bankroll art, and even influence elections. Case in point, in 1519, Fugger poured what would now be the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars into securing the election of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor. That's right, he essentially bankrolled a royal coronation. It wasn't just the size of his wealth, it was the leverage that mattered. When kings needed cash, they came to Fugger. When the Catholic Church needed financing, it was Fugger again. He had more power behind the scenes than many rulers had on their thrones. When Emperor Charles V took his time repaying the massive debts he owed, Jacob Fugger didn't stay quiet. He sent a letter, blunt and intimidating by 16th century standards. In it, he reminded the most powerful ruler in Europe, "It is well known, and clear as day, that your imperial majesty could not have obtained the Roman crown without my help." That's not a humble banker talking. That's a man who basically bought an empire. Over time, even the Catholic Church became deeply indebted to Fugger. To repay what they owed, church leaders began selling what were essentially spiritual passes to heaven, known as indulgences. That move triggered public outrage and then a revolution. The protests that followed sparked the Reformation, a religious movement that forever changed Christianity, and it all traces, at least in part, back to Jacob Fugger's balance sheets: banker, kingmaker, revolutionary catalyst. But Fugger wasn't just about power and profit. He also built what is widely considered the world's first social housing project. Located in Augsburg, Germany, the Fuggerei offered affordable housing to the poor. And here's the wild part. It's still open today. Over 150 people still live in those homes, for the symbolic price of €1 per year, plus a daily obligation to pray 3 times for the Fugger family. At his peak, Fugger is estimated to have controlled 2% of Europe's GDP, worth about $400 billion in today's dollars. But to find the true title holder of richest person in history, we need to go even further back. Next segment, Mansa Musa, the Gold King of Mali. The year is 1324, and one man is about to go on a journey so extravagant, the entire world takes notice. His name was Mansa Musa, the ruler of the Mali Empire in West Africa, a kingdom rich beyond imagination thanks to 2 of the most valuable resources of the time, salt and gold. And Musa had a lot of gold. When he embarked on the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, he didn't travel lightly. An entourage of 60,000 people, hundreds of camels, and generous amounts of gold followed him across the Sahara. He handed out gold everywhere he went, funding mosques, giving to the poor, and showering entire cities in his wealth. In fact, Musa spread so much gold during his trip that he crashed multiple regional economies, most notably in Egypt, where gold's value dropped sharply due to oversaturation. To fix it, Musa had to borrow back the very gold he gave away, temporarily stabilizing things until he repaid the debts and crashed the economy again. His pilgrimage cost the equivalent of billions, but it also turned him into a legend. He started appearing on world maps, drawn decked in gold, seated on a golden throne. He became known as the man who redefined wealth itself, the original flexor. But here's the tricky part. We can't say exactly how much Mansa Musa was worth. There are no bank records, no tax statements, just second-hand accounts from shocked travelers and historians centuries later. Still, some scholars believe he may have controlled as much as half of the world's gold supply at the time. The most common estimate for his modern equivalent net worth? $400 billion. But some estimates suggest figures much higher. Given the staggering volume of wealth and resources he controlled, many believe Musa was, and still is, the wealthiest person in all of recorded history. But let's go back just 100 years before Musa to a man whose riches weren't measured in gold or cash, but in raw power. Next segment, Genghis Khan, Emperor of the Earth. In the early 1200s, a warrior rose through the steppes of Mongolia and would go on to conquer more ground than any other human in history. That man was Genghis Khan. At its height, the Mongol Empire, which he founded, spanned nearly 20% of the Earth's land surface, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. That's more than the Roman Empire, British Empire, or Napoleon's France ever did. If you were to assign a modern monetary value to everything he had access to, land, resources, people, the figure soars to around 130 trillion. So, does that make him the richest? Not exactly, because Genghis Khan didn't keep wealth for himself. Part of what made him such an effective and feared leader was his commitment to mutual reward. He shared the loot from his conquests among his generals and soldiers, evenly and strategically, cementing deep loyalty throughout his ranks. He dressed simply, ate what his troops ate, slept under tents. Genghis famously instructed he be buried in an unmarked grave, with no treasures and no elaborate ceremony. His power was absolute, but his personal wealth was almost non-existent by design. So while his empire was worth trillions, his wallet was nearly empty. Genghis Khan may not have craved personal possessions, but based on the sheer scale of land he controlled, it's fair to say his influence and resources rivaled any fortune in history. But now, let's go even further back, to the very start of the Common Era. It's 1 AD, though the people alive back then wouldn't call it that. To the Romans, it's year 754. For the Jews, it's 37 and 61. The Chinese believe it's the year 9, and the Greeks, around 194. In short, no one realizes they're living through the birth of a new millennium. The world is incredibly diverse. The Maya are building advanced cities in the Americas. India is thriving through oceanic and Silk Road trade. China has just invented paper. And in Rome, one man stands at the center of it all. Augustus Caesar, fresh off his victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Augustus adds Egypt to the Roman Empire, not as a Roman territory, but as his personal property. As Rome's first official emperor, Augustus controls around 20% of the empire's total economic output. That includes taxation, public revenues, imperial treasuries, gold and silver mines, and spoils from conquest. He even had a chilling wealth strategy, executing wealthy citizens and confiscating their estates to refill imperial coffers. When Augustus died in 14 AD, the Roman Senate declared him a god. Estimates place his personal fortune at a modern equivalent of $5 trillion, making him arguably the wealthiest emperor in Western history. Now we turn the clock back another 900 years, into a time when civilization itself was in its infancy. Currency coins don't exist. Most people live short and grueling lives, yet one ancient ruler reportedly swam in unimaginable wealth. King Solomon of Israel. According to biblical texts, Solomon received a staggering 666 talents of gold in annual tribute. That's over 25 tons of gold per year. He lived in luxury, surrounded by treasures, palaces, 700 wives, and a nation flowing in gold. If we were to translate his wealth into modern numbers, some estimates put his fortune north of $2 trillion. But here's the issue. Our only sources are religious texts written centuries after his rule. Records from this period are extremely limited and often embellished. So while King Solomon is legendary for his wealth, it's impossible to know how much of it was fact and how much was storytelling. When you look at all these historical titans, Rockefeller, Mansa Musa, Augustus, Solomon, Genghis Khan, They make even modern billionaires seem small. And it's true, by some historic metrics, Elon Musk doesn't top the list. In 1913, for example, John D. Rockefeller was worth about 2% of US GDP. Today, Elon Musk's fortune, around $400 billion, is about 1.4% of GDP. So technically, Rockefeller had a larger slice of the economic pie. But here's the twist. That pie is now 22 times bigger than it was in 1913. Which means, while Rockefeller had a bigger share, Elon Musk lives in an era of unprecedented global wealth. He's the biggest fish and the largest, most connected financial system the world has ever seen. What makes Elon's fortune unique is its verifiability and personal accessibility. It's not tied to secret vaults or military conquests. It's not locked inside a collapsing empire. It's not rumors passed down over centuries. His wealth exists in real time, in stocks, assets, and tech that he helped build. And unlike emperors or monarchs, Musk doesn't need a crown or an army. He has access to space programs, AI labs, and quantum chips that ancient kings would have thought were magic. So is Elon Musk the richest person in history? By ancient standards, maybe not. But in the modern world, yes. His personal fortune is not just the largest on record. It's the most technologically empowered, the most independent, and the most transparent of any fortune before it. And here's what history tells us. At some point, someone will become even richer. But based on every trend we've seen so far, everyone else will rise with them. Because over time, the world keeps growing, not just in wealth, but in opportunity,